Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Meena Bose. I'm the director of Hofstra's Peter S. Kalikow Center for the Study of the American Presidency, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here today to our panel, Understanding the 2014 Midterm Elections and the Consequences for 2016, a panel that is co-sponsored with Hofstra's National Center for Suburban Studies, my co-moderator, executive director, Larry Levy, longtime political columnist for Newsday. I'm going to keep my introduction very brief because we have much to discuss with three distinguished panelists. I should say that yesterday I was speaking with a colleague in presidential studies, and I mentioned the post-election panel. And they said, well, 2014 was a midterm election year. Has Congress usurped the presidency? And then as I look at today's news, I wonder if maybe the reverse is the case as we look at the debate over immigration and whether an executive order is a suitable way for governance. But we hosted a midterm election panel in 2010. We had planned it well before the election results were in place, when the House Republican Party retook control of the House. And Larry and I decided that it's important for us to host the midterm election panels because of what they reveal about prospects for governance for the presidency, about voter turnout and the health of American democracy, a source of concern from the recent elections where voter turnout was below 40%. It was actually a little higher in the 2010 elections. And of course, looking ahead to 2016. Now, I somewhat hesitate to do that this early in the process, except I will say that on election night, November 4th, if you were following any of the news shows, everyone was talking about 2016, even before the results were in. So it is a timely topic. To set the stage, we're going to move into discussion very quickly, but the day after the election, I was speaking with one of my colleagues in political science who said that the midterm elections in 2014 were a repudiation of President Obama's policies. I said, maybe it's a rebuke, but are those semantics, or is there a real distinction here as far as President Obama's prospects for governance? And is bipartisanship a possibility with divided government in the 114th Congress, or even in the remaining weeks of the 113th? These are the questions, among others, that will guide our discussion today. Before we begin formally, I wanted to just say a few words of thank you. First and foremost, to our University Relations and Cultural Center staffs, Carla Schuster, Athleen Collins, Colin Sullivan, Carol Mallison. I know I'm leaving others out, but many great thanks for everything you've done to put this event together. To the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Dean Firestone, the Provost's Office, Provost Berliner, of course the President, President Rabinowitz. And it's a special treat to have Peter Kalikow, the founder of our Presidential Studies Center, here with us today. Thank you all for taking the time to join us. We have several classes in attendance, as you see, and I may not identify all of you by name, but a special thanks to my American Politics class. I see you right there in the middle. They're ready with your questions. Oh, in the back too, okay. We have a group of students from Herrick's. It's wonderful to see you with Professor Mr. Sillis is with us today, and Mr. Simon's students from Friends High School. And teachers as well. Thank you for joining us. Let me, without further ado, introduce our panelists and then turn the floor over to my colleague, co-moderator, and good friend, Larry Levy. We have three speakers today. Two of them are Kalikow Center Senior Presidential Fellows, Governor Howard Dean and Mr. Ed Rollins. Governor Dean is former governor of Vermont, chairman of the Democratic National Committee, U.S. presidential candidate, and practicing physician. Governor Dean, as chairman of the DNC, created and implemented the 50-state strategy that was widely credited with helping the Democrats make historic gains in 2006 and 2008. And under his leadership, significant resources were dedicated to revitalizing the Democratic Party by building and strengthening its organization, technology, and infrastructure. They could use your advice again, Howard, I think it's safe to say, after the elections 2 weeks ago. Governor Dean joined the Kalikow Center as a senior presidential fellow in 2009, and in that capacity, he speaks at panels regularly and meets with our students. Mr. Ed Rollins is one of our leading national political strategists and communications experts. He managed Ronald Reagan's 49-state landslide re-election victory in the Electoral College in 1984 and has had major managerial roles in 9 other presidential campaigns. Ed, rumor has it that you might be taking on another presidential campaign in 2016, or at least I've created that rumor now. That's just from the coffee chatter I heard before the panel this morning. Ed is a Fox News commentator. My class saw him on election night. He was on the video screen, and my peer teacher found the video. We've discussed that, and he provides political analysis for many other networks and programs. He also joined the Kalikow Center as a senior presidential fellow in 2009, was inducted into the American Association of Political Consultants Hall of Fame in 2010, and Ed teaches a class on presidential leadership and policymaking at least once a year and visits our classes frequently as well. Mr. Josh Robin is political reporter for New York One. You may have seen him on TV because he is frequently a guest host for Inside City Hall, New York One's nightly political program. He is the Albany reporter for New York One, and he has covered some major stories, including the resignation of Governor Spitzer, the rise of Governor Patterson, the worst fiscal crisis we've faced in a generation, Hurricane Sandy and the reconstruction effort afterward, and many other significant news stories. Before joining New York One, Josh was a newspaper reporter for the New York City edition of Newsday, the Seattle Times, and the New York Times. For his work at Newsday, he was part of a team that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize on Spot News. Josh is an active and busy reporter, and we are very glad that he's able to spare the time to join us today. And I should say we're also very pleased that the Robin family is with us, especially Josh's father, who I understand is not only a loyal fan of Josh, but of Hofstra and was a chemistry major here. And we're glad to have you back to participate in our discussion of American politics. Please join me in welcoming all of our panelists. To facilitate discussion, we are going to move directly into questions. We'll have panel discussion for about, I think, Larry, we said about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up we'll try to maximize time for questions. So, Larry, without further ado, I'll turn it to you.
Well, I'm going to take a hint from Professor Bose and step into a big picture question. Were the 2014 elections a referendum on President Obama's leadership? And if so, what are the implications for the rest of his presidency? Let me start down at the end there.
Well, they certainly were partly a referendum on President Obama's leadership. Most of the presidents in my lifetime in their 6th year have done not very well. And that's just the way it is, the so-called 6-year itch. Most people, not all, Bill Clinton picked up a couple of seats, but that was most likely because I think the American people thought that impeachment was overreach. But most presidents lose seats, so there was going to be some of that. But the referendum on the president's leadership, or popularity, I should say, is absolutely a fact. First of all, it motivated the Republicans to come out in ways that we don't often see. Their turnout was clearly better than ours, and that goes through all ethnic groups and so forth. Ours was particularly awful. I think this was the worst turnout in the last, half century or something like this in the midterms. And that's mostly reflected in the Obama coalition not coming to the polls. So it wasn't so much the anger at the president, which is sort of a chronic Republican feature. It was the disenchantment and the disaffection of the core group of people that elected Barack Obama, which were young people under 35, who turned out in very low numbers relative to their extraordinary performance in 2008, when young people under 35 voted in excess of the number of people who were over 65, which hasn't been done in my lifetime before or since. This is a young person's president. So for young people not to come out, we suffer for that. African-American turnout was down by, I think, more than a third. Latino turnout was down more than that. These are the core groups. And even single women were down, and that's a core group for us. So every one of our really hardcore base groups didn't turn out. And I think that says as much about the feeling about the president's popularity as whatever the Republicans had to say in their ads. Republicans were able to motivate their base to come out because they didn't like Barack Obama. The big problem was not that for us. The big problem was that our base didn't care enough to come out, and they're going to pay a big price for it, unfortunately, in the next 2 years.
I agree. I think that turnout certainly was a huge problem, but it wasn't, I would say, just the Republicans' fault for using the president in ads. It was also the Democrats' fault for not having a cohesive strategy of either embracing the president. A lot of Democrats now, maybe being a Monday morning quarterback, are saying that they should have rallied around the president, talked about what he did positive, the fact that so many more people have health insurance now, the fact that unemployment is way down from what it was. So I think that this was a case of Democrats running away from the president when I'm not sure it would have made a difference, but it certainly couldn't have been any worse for the Democrats. Additionally, just to follow on what the governor is saying, I think that typically young people, as he says, do not turn out as much, didn't turn as much, or turn out as much during this last election. I think typically you find that during midterm elections, they don't follow politics as much. Certainly the president the president is elected every 4 years. This is a midterm election. And there wasn't the same level of concentration that you see from older people who, in this case, tend to have voted more Republican. So the numbers certainly weren't there for the Democrats, and the Democrats are right now going over in their heads what they could have done differently. Perhaps actually seeing the positive in President Obama would have been a winning strategy.
Thank you. It's always a privilege to be out here, and sometimes my voice doesn't carry, so if it doesn't carry, someone raise a hand in the back if you can't hear me. So you're raising a hand in the back? Okay. I've been in this business for 50 years. So the day after the election, I work on an all-Democrat firm. It was a firm that was founded by the Bill Clinton people. One of the partners, Doug Mann, has been the principal advisor. So when I came in the election, the day after the election, everyone says, "Well, you're the only guy in New York. There's a smile on your face, and why are you such a gracious winner?" I said, "Because I've been a terrible loser, and it occurs very frequently. It's a cycle type thing, and I think the Republicans have a lot to be proud of. And whether you call this a wave election, a mandate election, or whatever, the bottom line is we got the ball back, and we have an opportunity over the next 2 years to run with the ball. The good part for Republicans is they have an opportunity to put an agenda forward that is not conflicted by the different congressional bodies, and that whether the president wants to cooperate or not is the untold story. I think if he moves forward with his executive order on immigration, he will basically destroy the possibilities of doing that. But I think the key thing here is that Republicans have to determine that you can't have internal battles. You have to be a unified picture to the outside world. You have to show that the government can work again. And I think the country is terribly, they don't love Republicans any more than they love Democrats. At the end of the day, the country is very disgusted with the whole political process, doesn't think it works. And this was a late-breaking election in the sense that, and I argue, people say the polls were way off, what have you. The polls that matter are the polls in the individual campaigns, and I basically tracked this all the way through. I said to Howard a couple weeks ago when we were out here, I said, we're going to pick up 8 Senate races. I said that on Fox News about 4 weeks ago, and everyone said, well, you're way over your skis. And I came back the next week, and I said, they said, you still believe in 8? And I said, I believe in 9. And I said, I think we're going to get 12, 14 House seats. And they said, how do you know that? Well, the reason I know that is I talked to the people who were out there doing the campaigns, and they knew there was a wave coming, and they knew that there was an intensity among their voters, and at the end of the day, Democrats also knew that there was a lack of intensity, and I think the premise that it's about the president or all the rest of it, I think at the end of the day here, it's we got our vote out, we basically matched the Democrats in the field for and we had some very good candidates, and we had a very unique schedule this time. We were in races, the Senate races were in places that mattered in the sense of us having opportunities. Obviously, that switched back in 2 years when there's 25 Senate seats that we have to defend as opposed to 10 Democrat seats. But I think the key thing here is Republicans have an opportunity to move the ball forward. This has nothing to do with 216. other than the fact I think it forces Hillary Clinton, if she's going to basically be the Democrat nominee, to get into the game earlier and sort of bring people back together again. Most people now think she's the only one who can basically re-intensify the premise that's out there, the people that basically put these coalitions together. I'm going to give you two quick statistics. 75% of the vote was white. 60% of those who voted, white voters, voted for Republicans. That's a staggering figure, but that's the reality. African-American voters were down. Those who voted obviously voted in the same kinds of numbers for the president's party. We are a very polarized society today. Young versus old, people of color versus white. There's an intensity, and the most telling figure today, someone that's looked at polls for 50 years, if you go to church on Sunday, if you're Jewish, evangelical, what have you, or go to church more often than once a month, you're pretty inclined to be a Republican. If you don't go to church at all, if you're an atheist or don't believe in something, you're more inclined to be Democrat. Those aren't my figures. Those are the polling figures. So every show I go on, people say you got to get rid of the moral majority. You got to basically be an establishment party. And I explained to them the problem is that 25% of the electorate in this cycle, 25% of the electorate were self-identified as evangelical voters. 82% of those voters voted for Republicans. So that is a base of our party. And when you start the presidential politics, when you go to Iowa, it's 38% of the people who self-identified in Iowa who voted, and 40% in South Carolina. And in case you don't realize it, the Republican process, first three states are Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina. So if you don't play to that base somewhat, and you don't make that base happy, you're not going to be a viable candidate long term. So,
Josh, you wanted to jump in to respond to something.
I did. Something that Ed said was really interesting to me is that the people have a distrust. People share a distrust in government now because government has not worked well together over the last number of years. And I think that also gave the advantage to Republicans. People have more of a distrust in government working together. They have more of a distrust in government. I think that's going to bring Republicans out to have less government and not more government, which is what the Democrats' agenda is. That's at least my thought.
I want to amplify something Josh said and also have sort of make a friendly amendment. I don't think the problem is that the Democrats failed to go out and defend Obama. I think the problem is they had no message whatsoever. The Republican message, and the Republicans are generally much better at messaging than Democrats are in terms of discipline, was we're not Barack Obama. That was essentially their entire campaign. They said almost nothing about any substantive issue whatsoever. The Democrat message was, oh, we're not Barack Obama either, really. I mean, it was totally uncredible.
Played right into it.
It was ridiculous. I mean, Bill Clinton once said that the public will always vote for someone who's strong and wrong before they'll vote for somebody who's weak and right. Harry Truman said if you run a Republican, a real Republican against a Democrat who votes like a Republican, the real Republican wins every time. People want authenticity. And with the exception of Kay Hagan, who lost anyway in a tough state because of turnout problems, who ran a great campaign, we generally ran awful campaigns. I mean, for Allison Grimes to somehow choose to spend the last 2 weeks of her election, which was a gazillion-dollar election, and arguing about whether she did or did not vote for Barack Obama, I mean, that was one of the dumbest campaign maneuvers I have ever seen in my life in politics. I couldn't believe that her staff would let her do that. The way you answer that question is, of course I voted for Obama. I'm a Democrat, and I disagree with him on these 4 things, or whatever. Or this is what I'd do differently. So, I mean, the Democrats were afraid. And people do not vote for candidates who are afraid, no matter what their platform is. And that is, other than the turnout, the reason the turnout was low is why would you go to vote for your candidate who's running on the chicken platform? And that's basically what we were doing.
Let me actually pick up, Ed, let me ask one question to just kind of direct this further. I was actually going to ask about divided government, but since Howard brought up authenticity, it seems to me that in midterm elections, it's traditional for the president's party to lose seats. I mean, the exceptions are few, 1934, 1998, 2002. Typically, the president's party loses seats. To lose seats on this scale and lose control of one chamber and potentially to have the opposition party have the largest number of seats in the House since at least World War II, possibly 1929, this is a resounding message for the Obama White House. My question is this. It's unusual, I think, in midterm elections for the parties to have an overriding message. If anything, the message seems to be primarily competence, and I think this is largely what Governor Cuomo, Josh, maybe you could start with this discussion, campaigned on was competence, getting things done in New York State. So my question is this: if we extrapolate from New York State as our microcosm, could President Obama have done more to help his party in 2014? Or, and then perhaps Howard and Ed, you have thoughts on this, was this more a failure of the Democratic National Committee and the party leadership in Congress?
I think that the president could have done more, but he was restrained. He was restrained by his own political team. He was restrained by the individual campaigns who thought that the Democrats would be better off running as I'm not Obama, but I'm this. They're wobbly campaigns, the chicken campaigns, as the governor was saying, which is, I think, totally right. It's very striking to me that the president, who was such a great messenger when he was presidential candidate, particularly the first time, has been an incredibly ineffective messenger when he is actually in charge. If you ask people individually about what his particular platforms are, they'll agree with him a lot of the time, maybe not entirely, but more times than you would think, given the romp that the Republicans just had. And it's also striking to me that a number of states that voted for Republicans had individual measures, let's say boosting the minimum wage, which is something the president supports, and not necessarily something that the Republican supports. They were in favor of that, but at the same time they voted for Republicans. So I don't think that you can extract necessarily a message that the president was the one at fault here. At the same time, you can blame him for not unifying the party for whatever reason, and perhaps having more of a spine to say that what I'm doing and what I've done is in the best interest of the nation, and to have more authenticity and bite behind it. I completely agree with the governor. I think that it was a question of performance. It was a question of not standing for something. It was a mixed message. The Republicans had a much clearer, crisper message, and I think that the Democrats were punished not just by swing voters, but also their own party not coming out when they were disgusted by the fact that folks were going all wobbly.
The interesting thing about this election, it's a deep election. We've had two elections in 2010, in this particular election, in which you went very deep into state legislatures, what have you. Over 2/3 of the state legislatures are now controlled by Republicans. There's over 4,000, there's about 8,000 legislators across the country, close to 8,000. We now have a majority of that, which we haven't had in a long, long time. And I think it's 66 or 69 that we control the legislatures. There's two campaigns. There was a national campaign that Republicans were not Obama, and they were basically if you elected a Republican Senate, you could basically stop the Obama agenda, whatever that may be or may not be. And then there were local elections and the state governors. We expected early on that we had a great number of governors who were running for re-election. The only governor who lost was basically Tom Corbett, who basically got governor of Pennsylvania, who got engrossed in the Penn State and never could get that off his shoe. And that became a liability to him. And the governor of Alaska, who was defeated to a Republican who was running as an independent with the Sarah Palin endorsement of the independent. So we have now 31 governors and 32 if you count the Alaska governor. That's the most we've had in a long time. The Senate is the most we have had in my lifetime. You have to go back all the Reagan years or what have you. We had 53 with the Reagan landslides, and that was the maximum. We'll now have 54, 55 when we get finished here. And the House, we've never had, again in my lifetime, which I'm 71 years old, which is a long lifetime as far as I'm concerned, hope for 20 more years.
That's it?
20 is plenty. But I think what happened is that this was also a late breaking election, which it reminded me, I kept saying to Howard, this reminds me of 80. And most of you in this room are not old enough, but 1980, we knew Reagan was going to beat Carter pretty early on, but we had a whole segment of voters who sat up there and floated. We had no idea that we were going to elect 12 senators. Nobody predicted we were going to elect 12 senators. And many of them who did get elected didn't understand how they got elected, and 12 years later, when many of them, or 6 years later, when many of them got defeated, they didn't understand how they lost. But at the end of the day, there was a wave. And I think in this particular case, whatever the term you use, this was a very unique election, and I think to a certain extent there's consequences. The problem with lame duck, though, is you come back and it's the same group of people sitting there, and I don't think the Democrats quite realize yet that come January, it's a different game. I mean, it's a dramatically different game. And I think Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi, you're going to discover being in the minority is not much fun. Now, clearly the president has the veto power, and he can either cooperate or not cooperate. But I think Republicans are determined they're going to move an agenda forward and then try and make an appeal to the American public.
Howard, can I just ask you to, thank you, Ed and Josh, can you just say a few words as former committee chairman? Do you think, I mean, you oversaw the 2006 campaigns and 2008. What more could have been done in 2014?
Well, it's a different game when you have the presidency. Actually, the DNC, and I think this is true of the RNC as well, when there's a Republican president, simply doesn't have the ability to do the things that I was able to do with my team in 2004, because I didn't have anybody that was telling me what to do. I mean, the people in Washington tried, but none of them voted for me for chair, so I just basically fired all their consultants who we'd paid a hell of a lot of money to tell us how to lose every 4 years, and did it my way. And the results, I don't take all the credit for it, but the results were extraordinary. I mean, we took over the House, the Senate, and the White House, and we had none of those before. You can't do that if you're running the DNC with an incumbent president. And if you're a Republican, you can't do it if you're running the RNC. Because the president and the White House control the DNC, or the RNC, depending on which party the president is. So the organization becomes essentially a re-elect organization for the president. That is the primary purpose of the DNC. And when the president isn't running for re-election, as this president isn't, they drift. They still depend on the DNC for political stuff, but the DNC has essentially been neutered, in my view. And I think that happens to a certain extent with the RNC, with the president. They just don't focus on that, but they're in charge. So I don't blame the DNC, because whatever big decisions were made in the White House about the campaign, and not made. It hasn't been a big decision made in the DNC, I'm guessing, since 2008.
There's one other factor, though, Howard. All the political operatives that were in the White House, and having been the political operative in the Reagan White House, they all have left. Axelrod, Pluff, Messina, they're all gone. They're all outside the White House. Valerie Jarrett is the principal person who advised the president's never been near a campaign in her life. The president himself had obviously had been elected president twice, but all the people who basically day in, day out looked at the campaigns, coordinated the campaigns, are not there anymore. And that wouldn't have necessarily changed it, but at least the president and his team would have been more into the game. And I think the problem was that we had a national message. We were not Obama. We were not free. And then when he said, I'm not on the ballot, but my policies are, it gave us that ability to nationalize a midterm election, which seldom you ever get to do. And having been the chairman of the Congressional Committee, I always advocate my candidates, as Tip O'Neill, run local. In this particular case, running local was not the key. It was in the governor's races, but not in the Senate races, the House races. Run nationally, run against Obama, run against what they've done in Washington.
Let me just add quickly, this is obviously I'm very distraught about the election, but I'm not so distraught about losing the Senate. I think that's unfortunate, and there were some great people that I really liked that didn't win. What kills me is the legislatures. That can't be undone so easily. Right. I think we're probably going to win the Senate because the math is awful for the Republicans the next year around in terms of the echo of 2010 and so forth. And I think we have a decent shot at winning the presidency. But the legislatures, you don't take back. There are 24 states now with Republican governors, Republican House, and Republican Senate. That's almost half the states are one-party states. That you don't get to take back. Even with a really big turnout, which I think we're going to get in 2016 because it's a presidential year, it's going to be very hard to do the gritty work at the state legislative level. And the people who fund the campaigns in Washington have very little interest in state legislatures on the Democratic side. And the Republicans, they've gotten this for a long time. They've been working on this for 20 years. We have not. And until the Democrats in Washington figure out that the state legislatures matter a lot, this party is going to be struggling uphill. That's the thing that bothers me the most. It's the hardest to reverse, and there's not much of an inkling among the people who are running the show in Washington on the Democratic side that state legislatures matter. They pay lip service, they have an organization, but the organization can't raise any money because none of the big funders are interested. They all want to hobnob with senators and presidents. If you're not willing to spend the time to build the base, you can't expect to have a party that works, and right now, we don't have a party that works.
I'd like to turn for a time to the voters who more and more, for even at least a generation now, determine national elections, and those are suburban voters. Most of the competitive congressional districts in the country are wholly or substantially suburban, and consequently, most of the seats Republican picked up were in the suburbs. So I want to ask you guys, if you think the election results signal a trend of suburbanites returning to their Republican roots. Suburbs weren't always competitive. They used to be Republican bastions. Or if this is an aberration brought on by, low turnout or temporarily disgruntled swing voters.
If you look at the reapportionment map, if you look at the map, the post map, one of the staggering things when you look at the reds and the blues, and I'm sure most of you have seen it's been the New York Times and everything else. The Democrat districts are on the coast. California, they're on the coast, and they run right down the sides of the two coasts. The middle of the country is, in the rural suburban areas, is all the reds. And when the reapportionment and the thing that people missed in 2010, that election was so important because the lines were redrawn after that. And the story that no one has focused on is these lines are in place till 2020 when there's another census, which means there won't be a new districts until 2022. So for the next long period of time, these are the same congressional districts. And what happened is Nancy Pelosi in San Francisco draws a district that is 82% Democrat district. The urban areas, all basically that are Democrat, have so stuffed themselves with Democrats, and the rural areas have basically spread them out a little bit more, that really to get back the 30 or 40 votes that they need is going to be extremely difficult, and even another wave election. So my sense is Republicans are dug in on the House. I think they're going to be dug in some of these state legislatures, and they're going to be prepared for the reapportionment again in 2020. I've lived in reapportionment since my days in California, when Jess Unruh, who's the speaker, came in with a map from a gasoline station and a crayon, and basically drew it. And now you do it all by computers and all the rest of it. And what happened is, in the conflicts that the Democrats have in a state like California, where they have a gigantic, which I grew up in, you now have the Hispanic voters and the African American voters living in the same communities. And so it's not quite as easy to create Hispanic districts unless you basically eliminate some African American districts. And so they've got real problems. Well, we've got the rural districts and what have you, and it's and a lot more turf to draw lines. Now, certainly the Californias, the New Yorks, the big states are going to basically stay Democratic. But I think the districts across the country are going to change. So I don't think it's a question of being the suburbs are now Republican, will always be Republican. I think the districts in the suburbs and the rural areas are now Republican, right. And I think that's why.
We also have another problem, and this is the problem. The Republicans, the quote-unquote wise men in the Republican Party, and of course, unfortunately, in the Republicans, it's mostly wise men. The problem that we have is that the Republican leadership, the inside players who are obviously very smart, they want to win. I mean, more important than any party's ideology is they want to win. And there were two signs that I picked up in this last election, which shows me that they may now be in a position where they're starting to figure out how to build a coalition that can win longer term. Tom Cotton and Joni Ernst were very, very conservative House of Representatives member and state legislator, respectively. They both had supported personhood amendments. A personhood amendment basically outlaws all abortions of all forms and a good deal of birth control as well. And this is something that the Right to Life people have been pushing for a long time. During these campaigns, especially Cotton, who had a pretty decent lead through it was Cotton winning over Pryor was not a big surprise. Ernst was closer and it was harder, and then she pulled away in the last minute. Both of them denied that they any longer supported a personhood amendment. What that signifies, which is an extreme form that most Americans are not comfortable with. What it signifies to me is, even among what we would consider on the Democratic side hard right, there is now beginning to be a flexibility, understanding that they cannot win young people if they're inflexible, particularly on women's rights, on gay rights, and so forth. So you're seeing gradually, I think Rob Portman was a huge example when he decided he was a Republican senator, well-respected Republican senator from Ohio decided he was going to be for gay marriage. And what you're seeing is the beginning of the Republican Party adjusting to the reality that this country is not the same demographically, and that the beliefs of particularly the younger generation are not the same as their core base, which is made up largely of very, very conservative people. I think there's going to be a hard adjustment, but they're starting to make it, even in these big races. This is the first time I've seen this. And the Tea Party didn't win, I don't think, hardly any seats, especially in the Senate. That's very, very smart. It's the long-term future of the Republican Party. And what it indicates to me is that the Republicans are gradually starting to turn the aircraft carrier in a way that we know they have to turn it, which means that the suburban vote, which cares greatly about fiscal issues, but which has voted with us on a number of times when it was just too much to vote for the far right, who seem to represent them, the suburban vote, it could go back to being reliably Republican at all times. And if that happens, we're going to see a major political shift.
I'm also, I would be skeptical of any kind of long-term waves and any kind of long-term diagnosis of this last election. I think particularly if Hillary Clinton runs, which we expect that she will have great appeal within suburbs across the country, and that itself could be another wave for Democrats, maybe not enough to take over the House, but certainly enough to take a number of Senate seats.
I would agree with that. I think the critical thing, though, if you don't have Hillary running, and you have Howard Dean and others, I think we'll have a good long tenure here, Howard.
I thought you were my supporter, Ed.
I am your supporter. I have wanted you to run for president for so long again. I know you can do better than you did last time, and I'm dying for you to basically run again. This is our way of going back and forth, but it's fun.
I won 2 primaries the last time.
You won 2 what?
2 primaries the last time. I was very excited.
Was that in Canada or was it here?
This is that's one.
I won the province of Quebec, and I won, no.
I love Howard. I have great respect for Howard. The Democrat Party was well represented when he was chairman.
Thank you.
As I'm tempted to ask a question about governance, but I have one more question about elections, and then maybe we can shift to what the White House and Congress are going to do for the remainder of the 113th Congress and then looking ahead to the 114th. But there's an issue here of divided government that political scientists have been studying for some time. Divided government was not common before World War II. But since World War II, it's become much more common. The Democrats controlled the House for 40 years, 1954 to 1994. They controlled the Senate for all but 6 of those years, 1981 to 1987, when Republicans controlled the Senate. 1994 was a landslide election for the Republican Party. 2006, 12 years later, with a brief period where the Vermont senator started 18 months where the Democrats had control of the Senate in the Bush administration. But 12 years later, 2006, Democrats take control. 2 years later, with the increased gains with Obama's election, there were articles written about whether the Republican Party was going to go the way of the Whigs. Was the Republican Party going to disappear? Were we going to see a new political party? Well, here we are, 2 years later, there was a rebuke of President Obama. He wins re-election, but then 2 years later, divided government again. What lessons, I'm very attentive to your point, Josh, that we shouldn't overdiagnose this election. But what lessons, if any, can we draw? Are voters saying, is this a message about divided government? Is it frustration with the party in the White House or frustration with Washington more generally?
All the above. All the above. I think that Americans are very confused right now. The economy is certainly better than it was, but real wages haven't gone up for the vast majority of people. They've stayed flat, in fact. The jobs have been outsourced. People don't know how to communicate with each other anymore. There's all sorts of studies going on about how we don't talk to each other face to face anymore. It's all done through this. There's all sorts of psychological extrapolations that people are studying now that we can't necessarily put our finger on right now. Oh, there's the microphone. So, to answer your question, I think that all we can say right now is what the symptoms are as opposed to what the actual cause of this is. We're in a place right now where we're in a lot of flux in this country. And I'm sure that the leading presidential candidates, particularly Hillary Clinton, is talking not just to political scientists, but also to people who do psychological experiments, people who talk about long-term economics. It's a very weird state in this country right now. And I think that that's just the fact of life, of where we are in this particular era.
I think there's a second, I agree with everything that Josh said. There's another factor, and that is, which I've done a lot of thinking about it. I think the level of leadership in public service has gone down in general. I mean, people run for office not because they want to make the country a better place, but because they want to be United States senators. Their ambition. Now, there's always been ambition in politics, but there's a lot less statesmanship. And I think that has something to do with the fact that Washington has become more irrelevant, because the world is sped up so much that if you're a kid, 25-year-old kid, and you want to have an effect on life, you don't have to vote. I mean, you should vote because that's the price of living in a democracy, which we could lose if you don't. But you can go on the internet and find 500,000 people that agree with you and start. I mean, I know young people all over the world that have started revolutions in Egypt, for example. But they do more things than that. And they have these incredible projects. So you don't really need, if you want to reform education, you don't need to go through the political process. You just set up a charter school and fill it full of young people who are incredibly enthusiastic and may have to be trained a lot. And all of a sudden scores start going up. I mean, it's a different world. So the problem is that people, first of all, there was a great chart that was yesterday. I forgot what the source was. 90% of the people in this country have seen their wealth go down in the last 20 years, not up. The wealth gains in this country that would make the economy look so good are actually confined to the top 10% of people. So the average American is not feeling like the economy is getting better, even though we all think it is, because all the indicators we look at. So that's problem number one. And problem number two is they look at the political system and they find that it just doesn't deliver at all. It's not like we hated the political system because of the war or we needed progress on civil rights. These guys don't hate the political system, these kids. They just think it's irrelevant. And then, of course, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So all these voters are going, well, these people go to Washington and they keep talking past each other and they don't do anything. And our lives aren't changing, so why should we even bother?
It's also overrun by money. So much money goes into this that it's out of the reach of average people. And in my view, it's only getting worse. If you're a fan of campaign finance reform, you don't have the Supreme Court in your corner right now. Now, there could be other arguments about it, but the proof is in the pudding. If you're in one of these swing states, you are just absolutely inundated anytime you turn on the TV by vacuous attack ads that don't explain anything. I'm a big critic of, even though I'm in the profession, of how things are reported. The public discourse in this country has become quite coarse, and I'm unfortunately not particularly optimistic in the short term. But seeing people in the audience who are young, it's your responsibility to turn it around.
95% of all advertising done, there was more money spent in this midterm election than ever in the history of the country. 95% of the advertising that was done, that was wall to wall in these targeted states, was negative. So if you're sitting there every day saying, perfect example is the governor of this state spent $30 million on negative television to beat someone that he could have beat with a yard sign, a very dear friend of mine, but he could have beat him with a yard sign. There was nothing about what a great governor he's been. It's about what a crappy guy Rob Astorino is. So obviously people don't think more kindly about Governor Cuomo and barely his voting numbers, which was a record low again in New York City, New York State. He got reelected, but he didn't basically sell. It used to be you sell your story in the campaign. Campaigns were a very important part of the drill. It's not an accident that more and more people, and particularly younger people, the plurality party today is not Republicans or Democrats, it's independents. Now there's a pattern how they vote, but it's how the independents vote today, and young people in particular don't see any premise. I also don't think, going back to the political science question, it used to be, geographically we have changed, demographically we've changed dramatically in this country. And in the South, obviously, which is now all Republican. When I started in politics again 50 years ago, it was all Democrat. It was a solid, you could not find ever a switch. A Republican, John Tower was the first Republican to get elected in Texas. And that was an aberration. You could not ever basically vote for president and then not vote for governor and senator in the same party or congressional seats. The South was a solid place. It's a solid place again, but it's now switched to the other side. You don't have the swing voters. You don't have the Northeast liberals that were Republicans. You don't have And even though there may not be Tea Party, and I'm glad you're happy with the new group that's coming in, Howard, because
I don't think I exactly said that. You've been,
they-
been on
they-
Fox a
I-
little too long.
I promise, I always love the expertise of my party by the other party. The bottom line here is this is still a very conservative group that's coming in. The Tea Party still is going to have a big influence by the members who got elected in 210 and elsewhere. It's not going to be overwhelming. It's not going to be as radical in the sense of being out there yelling and screaming on the lawns of the. But inside, you have a very liberal Congress on the Democrat side and a very conservative Congress on our side. So you're not going to see a whole lot of moderation. I think to a certain extent, if this compromise, it's not like the old days where you sit down and have drinks and dinner and basically take a napkin out and figure out how the highway bill is going to work. It doesn't work that way anymore. I do think the thing that's so very important is that the process begin to work again, and the process is broken down. And I use the example of the immigration bill. Why should 8 senators be able to go in the back closet, led by John McCain and Schumer, and basically draft an immigration bill as opposed to the committees drafting an immigration bill? And then the president basically say, you take the Senate immigration bill or nothing. That's not the way it works. It's no political scientist will teach you that. So I think to a certain extent, the game has changed. People thought for a while divided government was pretty good because it kind of was a checks and balance. I think today people don't think it's good. I think people think it doesn't work. And I think to Howard's point, which I don't disagree with, I just don't think people today like what's going on in D.C. They don't, and sooner or later, when the expectations get high, as they did with President Obama, there's nowhere to go. When you start crashing, you don't stop till you hit the cement. And I think to a certain extent, that's what's happened with a lot of these political people. And it's why political people don't want to spend 30 years in politics anymore.
Ed brought up Andrew Cuomo. Before we leave that subject, I wonder if you'd like to comment, all three of you, on what this election, which was disappointing for many of Cuomo's supporters, means for his potential as a national candidate, if not 2016, 2020, 2024.
I think it's always been off the table until we find out what Hillary Clinton's going to do. There was no room for him to enter this race until we know for sure. And 2020 is such a long time from now. In particular, a couple of things about this race. Number one, we have to see what's going to happen with the Moreland Commission, this is an investigation that's gone into Andrew Cuomo, that he interfered with a anti-corruption commission. He corrupted the corruption commission, if you will, in shorthand, which is really only a New York statement.
That he set up.
That he set up, exactly. They started looking into allies of him, and he said, or he had his aides say, back off a little bit. So that's under investigation by the hard-charging U.S. attorney, Preet Bharara. The reason he did not do so well this last time is not just because of the Republican wave, but turnout was abysmal in New York City. It was incredibly depressing, to be honest with you, for people who believe in civic discourse. It was about 20% within New York City. And lastly, I think that turnout was very high in districts where gun rights matter a lot, because Cuomo, shortly after Newtown, New York became the first state in the nation to adopt a gun control bill that has a lot of people. If you drive anywhere north, let's say north and west of Albany, you'll see signs attacking the SAFE Act, it's called, all over the place. And frankly, it was a pretty, for New York, it was a pretty close election. That's something you didn't see. Certainly you didn't see it last time when Cuomo beat Carl Palladino. Palladino only won a few counties. And the time before was a record race when Eliot Spitzer beat John Faso. So it was a new type of election. These next 2 years, I should say, are going to be very interesting. The state Senate is now solidly controlled by Republicans. Cuomo, frankly, probably likes it that way because he has dealt well with the Republicans within the state Senate. If things go well, he can say that we're working well in a bipartisan way. If things go bad, he can blame the Republicans. It worked well for his father. It works well for him. He didn't help out fellow Democrats at all, or not nearly enough. Certainly there's a lot of grumbling about it behind the scenes. And now you're seeing, this is really getting into the weeds, but now you're going to see some really interesting things, machinations happen with this breakaway group of Democrats in the state. They're probably going to join the Republicans just so the Republicans have some sort of cushion 2 years from now, when the expectation is that more Democrats will come to vote and vote presumably for Hillary Clinton.
A cushion in New York Republicans? I mean, we don't even have a base.
It's an amazing fact that it's happened here, but there actually is a Republican Party within New York State.
Where is it? Can you tell me? Can you give me the address so I can go find it?
Dean Skelos is right around the corner from here.
That's door-to-door politicking. I can see we have questions in the audience, and we're going to move to those in just one moment. Let me ask one question about governance. President Obama has said, it's not even indicated, has said that he will take action on immigration by executive order unless the 113th Congress acts. Seems very unlikely. Certain House Republicans have threatened a government shutdown. Speaker Boehner is contending with that. We've seen several ups and downs with immigration over the past 4 years, over the past decade, really. McCain-Kennedy bill in 2005 didn't go anywhere. The Secure Fences Act a year later, emphasis on border security, but then the question of what to do with 11 million immigrants who are in the country without legal status. The House in 2010 did pass an immigration bill. It failed to overcome the filibuster in the Senate. In 2012, President Obama issued DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, right? It helped estimated 2 million immigrants, proposing to expand that to as many as 6 million with the next executive order. The Senate did pass a comprehensive immigration bill in 2013. The House has passed several smaller bills. What can I ask just all of you? What is the best way for President Obama to proceed? What do you think, and how will his actions shape policymaking for the next 2 years?
I think if he puts the executive order through, he'll basically blow up any relationship he has with the new Congress. And I think to a certain extent, having lived through the '86 bill, which is still the present law, it was a long process. It was a 5-year process. It was a bipartisan effort. Both houses voted it down at one point in time in the conference. But it's still the law of the land. And at the end of the day, it needs to be enforced. And the president's job is to enforce the law or his people's. So he cannot give citizenship. I mean, at the end of the day, with the untold story here, as everybody keeps talking about, he's going to give 4 million or 5 million people citizenship. He cannot give citizenship. What he can do is order the Department of HHS not to deport people. And then you're going to create 2 categories of people here. You're going to have those who are not going to have threat of deportation, and the other 5 or 6 million who are in the country illegally, and I don't think, and they're still worried about it. My sense is, if you give the Congress 2 years to work on this, Republicans understand how important this is. And it's not an up or down only on the Senate bill, because I'll tell you that bill would not pass the Senate today. So I think the reality is you've got to let it work its process. It's a complicated issue. Don't necessarily deport anybody, because I'm not sure there's a whole lot of people being deported anyways. But I think if the president steps in here, does an executive order, that will basically be the deal breaker as far as Republicans are concerned, and he'll have no cooperation on any major issues for the next couple of years.
That sounds about right, but this is also presuming that he has some sort of decent relationship with Republicans now.
She doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like they're drinking together. This isn't like Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill.
They didn't drink together.
Didn't toast each other?
No, that's Chris Matthews' book, but they didn't drink.
Okay. Anyway, that presumes a nice relationship that he has. The president is, he's a wallflower and kind of an introvert, but I'm not sure that really matters with the opposition that he had, particularly in the House over the last few years. So, I mean, obviously, I don't have any kind of advice of what he's going to do, but what Ed is saying sounds right, that it would poison the well. I think that there's been some smart people talking about the fact that they need to do some sort of financial tax bill where you'll get some common ground. The president, frankly, if you look at him, seems really frustrated. He doesn't want to be called the lame duck. He realizes that this is the last 2 years of his presidency, and he wants to do something, and it might not be the worst thing for him politically to feel like he's relevant again, but ultimately what's best from a legal standpoint for these immigrants. I mean, everyone realizes that we need to do some sort of comprehensive immigration reform. What's best for them? I'm not sure that executive action is the right way to do it.
From a political point of view, the best thing for the country, for the president, and for the Republicans is to come up with a bill and a compromise. The problem is that what the Democrats want is, at least at this moment, unacceptable to the House majority. So the only way that the Speaker can get an immigration bill through the House is to have 100 Democratic votes. And he's done that a couple of times, preventing government shutdowns. The question is, will he do it on this? The makeup of a compromise has to include the DREAM Act and some sort of attempt to keep families together so that if a kid was born here, you can't deport the parents. That has been and will be continued to be called amnesty. And the problem is inside the Republican Party, everybody understands that what the danger is that you're going to be run at from the right in a primary and on the platform that you supported, amnesty. So it's a huge problem. There's no trust whatsoever, and there's a great deal of animosity between the Hill and the White House, which actually extends to both parties, but it's much worse on the Republican side. And so the question is, I mean, the way this should be worked out is that Boehner and McConnell and Obama ought to get together and say, what can we pass, and let's try to fashion something and come to a compromise. And that could be done on the area of tax reform as well. The problem is there's been so much damage done in the last 6 years, I just don't know if they can get there. But the smart thing for the president to do, he's going to have to do something on immigration, whether the House agrees to it or not. So the smart thing is to try to get Boehner's word that he's willing to cobble together the agreement, and then he'd have to believe that word, and we'll see what happens. I think from our point of view, it's not a great thing to do the executive action. We'll get a huge boost in our Latino enthusiasm, but we're also going to really make a lot of people mad that we would like to keep in the tent, possibly for the presidential election.
Hofstra's national suburban poll and other surveys shows a high degree of support for what could be characterized as a reasonable immigration bill, but it also shows a low degree of tolerance for anything that could be perceived as extremism on either side. Is it possible to argue from that perspective that the best thing politically, not necessarily for the country, but politically for the Democratic Party, is that the president moves forward and the Republicans try to shut down government, which would be seen as far more extremist by the typical swing voter than moving independently on an immigration bill?
Republicans are not going to shut the government down. They've done it twice, and they got killed both times. They lucked out this last time by having a few years, and the competency of the president got questioned for a variety of reasons over the last 2 years. But that was a disaster. They know it was a disaster. McConnell has made it very clear he's not going to shut the government down. John Boehner knows he's not going to shut the government down. And if they do, then they basically are playing Russian roulette with 5 shells in the gun. So I think there's there are 3 or 4 things. I worry about tax reform. It needs to be done, and the blueprint is there on several things. But you have to understand it's going to be the Republican blueprint. Dave Camp, who's been the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, is retiring in January, probably did the most extensive look at how to reform taxes. And it's not 10-10-10, it's not flat taxes. I mean, he basically had thousands of witnesses come in. He spent 4 years having hearings, and it's a complicated issue. And what happens is the financial community, which is now making a lot of money, basically going to get hit. And they, of course, have the biggest, most powerful lobbyists. So the moment it came out of Ways and Means, they were the first guys up there saying, absolutely, this is dead on arrival. I mean, you've got to lower the corporate tax, and you somehow have to take small business that is now taxed at the 39% rate, and allow them to have lower rates in order to increase productivity. So my sense is, I think you could do a corporate individual rate overhaul. Again, a 2-year process. It's not going to happen overnight. I do think you got to get the budget reform back. You've got to do something about entitlements, what have you, and obviously that's the Paul Ryan plan. Again, that's not politically saleable, but the 3 big pieces of legislation, the immigration bill, the budget reform, and the tax bill, pieces of it are all there. The Republicans aren't going to get all they want, but they could get some of it. And I think Democrats have to understand that. But at the end of the day, they try and shove the 3 pieces down that I passed out. It's not going to go anywhere. So
Let's open this up for questions. I know I can see many people, and I can see there's so many questions. Okay, there's a microphone. We'll ask you to keep the questions brief, and if you can direct it to one panelist, that'll be good. Mr. Kalikow. Peter, the microphone's coming right there.
Or you can shout if you like.
The one thing that I noticed is that
It's okay. Put it right up close to your mouth. Nope.
Peter, if you give the president another $1 million, he'll give you a mic that works.
We got one.
No, you have one right there, Peter. We have a good one, a working mic.
The one thing that the panel did not discuss in the Senate election was there was an unusually strong class of Republican challengers. Republicans who ran for the Senate, who were challenged in a primary by a Tea Party, the challengers lost. The people, the men and women that they chose, I thought were extraordinarily centrist, which is my view. But more than that, I'm going to use some names because then Ed Rollins is impressed that I remember these names. But there was a guy named Castle who was the congressman at large from Delaware who was to replace Biden, and he lost to a woman who said that she was a witch and then spent the campaign trying to deny it.
She turned out to be a witch.
Right. Senator Lugar from Indiana lost to a very conservative right-winger in a primary, and of course, the Democrat won that election. So I think that's an important point. So Josh, tell me if you think I'm right.
You're right, sir.
And
No,
why?
you're right. There was an interesting column by David Brooks about this, that it's kind of the return of the Rotary Club, Country Club Republicans that a lot of people in this country admired, and it's not the same sort of radical individuals who are losing in the general election.
And one more thing.
To your point, Peter, historically we have never got involved in primaries, Republican national committees, the Senate committee, the House committee, or the national committee. They made a very determined effort this time that they were going to pick the best candidates. They were going to put their money in early, just as you did. We chased people out of the races this time. We basically wanted to win. We didn't want to have what happened to us last time, where there's probably 3 or 4 people who could have been U.S. senators who are not U.S. senators because of the losing the primary. So my sense is they had a strategy, they implemented the strategy, and the candidates who ended up beating incumbents were very strong candidates.
And one last thing, Josh. If you come here more often and watch these students, you're going to have a great feeling for the future of this country.
Absolutely.
Well, let's prove that comment, right? With
Let's hear
some
from the students.
question from a student. Okay, right, Lori, all the way over there. Yep. Yeah, keep that hand up. There you go.
Hello. That's loud. Anyway. All 3 of you mentioned that Hillary Clinton was basically guaranteed the Democratic nomination in 2016, but all of you failed to mention who potentially could be the Republican candidate. Who do you think that candidate could be, and do you think they have any chance whatsoever standing a chance against Hillary Clinton?
Everybody has a chance, and having spent, as I said, 5 decades in politics, I've watched too many people that absolutely didn't have a snowball's chance of winning. They vote in the U.S. Senate today, or they vote in the House of Representatives, and a few of them actually been president, including the one I worked for, Ronald Reagan, who Democrats said could not possibly win the presidency, and Jimmy Carter clearly wanted to run against him. So the truth of the matter is, and I didn't guarantee that Hillary can be the nominee. I think if Hillary runs, she's going to be very tough to beat, both in a primary and a general. But I don't know whether a Republican can beat her, but she may beat herself. She's not always run the best of campaigns. I can tell you the 2 teams that are going to play in the Super Bowl in 2017 easier than I can tell you who the nominee of our party is. But I can tell you that we're going to have some very strong candidates. A very key element to all of it is who can raise $150 to $200 million to win the primaries from January to January. That's the table stakes this time. And the moment they get the nomination, they got to go raise $2 billion to $3 billion to go be in the national. Those are the stakes are going to be. There are not a lot of people that can do that. We have some very fine governors they're going to run. We have a couple of senators. But I just give you my as a guy that's watched this for a long time. What is going to happen to our party, though, this time? It's going to basically not be beneficial. Is the moral majority, who I talked about a little bit earlier, evangelicals, have decided that they have taken kind of passes in the last couple of elections, and they've let the establishment candidates win. This time they are very determined to pick a candidate, the prominent candidate being Mike Huckabee, who I chaired his campaign 4 years ago. I'm not involved with him this time. Or basically Tom, Cruz, or one of the others, and they're going to pick a candidate early on. And that's where they're going to throw their resources, and they have very strong resources. So you probably end up with someone like Huckabee becoming the moral agenda candidate versus an establishment candidate. The states are not set yet, and the danger of, and I'm not cutting down my old friend Mike Huckabee, but he could be a very strong Southern candidate. He certainly can win Iowa, he certainly can win South Carolina, and any of these other candidates that get into this race, because of the media attention in those early races, like someone like Christie. If Christie can't win 2 out of the first 3, he's done. He's not going to get the money, the resources. Someone like Romney can come in late. He has the organization, he has the money. Someone like Bush can come in whenever he wants and has the money, has the organization. A couple of the governors, Perry can raise money, Casey can raise money, Walker can raise money, maybe not to the same extent as Romney and Bush, but I just think the money in the national organization is so important now that those are, you're gonna see kind of an up and down. And we have now made a determination in our traditional fashion to fight the last war that we need to get a nominee early, which I think is idiotic, so that we can have a 7-month presidential campaign. So we're going to basically, everything is front-loaded. The way the process works is there's four states that get to go first. Nevada, which is not very relevant to us long-term, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina. Then starting March 1st to March 15th, if you want to put a primary in there, it's proportional, meaning that the vote gets split up. After March 15th, it's a winner-take-all process. So, of course, all the big states are saying, thank you very much. I'm going to get into the winner-take-all. I'm not going to go do the proportional thing. So that you can get in late. You can win all the stuff early on and have, a few delegates, a few hundred delegates, and you can come in and win Texas the day after it's done, or New York, or Ohio, or San Francisco, or California, or what have you. And states that may not be important in the electoral college strategy for Republicans become very important because of the large number of delegates, New York, Pennsylvania, California, what have you. So I think you're going to see a very contracted game. They're going to limit the number of debates so that someone like Huckabee, who's a good debater, can't debate 22 times and get stronger as they go forward. They're going to have 10 debates. The RNC is going to basically penalize anybody that gets in any more than that. So I think you're going to see a different kind of race. And we end up with a nominee early convention, and then you're going to have a 6-7 month general election that's not going to be much fun to watch.
Let's move up here. There was a question here and then here. Okay.
As the panelists discussed in the earlier part of the discussion, you said that 75% of the voters during this midterm election were white. And this is a major trend that has been happening throughout midterm elections and non-presidential elections. And minorities and younger voters do not turn out during these elections. So how do you recommend the improvement of this and the more like voter turnout for younger and minority voters?
I didn't hear the last part of the question, but the answer to the first part is people need to vote. People need to take responsibility. There's really no excuses, unless you really don't like any of the candidates, which in itself I suppose is a statement. But we're all in it together. I feel pretty strongly about that.
I think that, yeah, the only problem with that is the ought does not get people to run. To vote, which it should, but it doesn't. So the alternative is that you've got to use the kind of machine that the president had in 2008 and 2012 and identify people. And I actually think the Republicans did a better job on turnout than we did in terms of identifying people and getting to the polls. The most important thing is you have to have a message. If your message is, gee, I really don't like the guy you all came out for 2 years ago to vote for, you might as well say, yeah, stay home because this isn't about anything that you care about. And I think that's what a lot of people felt in the core Democratic constituencies. When you, as a Democrat, if you can't motivate single women, you are really pathetic. Because that is the group at which there has been the largest, other than African Americans, consistently the largest turnout over the years in favor of Democrats in terms of actual numbers. Obviously, there are more single women than there are African Americans in this country. But, if you can't motivate that group, then, what the hell have you done? And I'm not Obama either is not a message that motivates anybody. And obviously didn't motivate swing voters because they didn't believe him. So I think that's part of the problem. If it were up to me and I could push a button, I'd make voting mandatory, and it's never going to happen because we're a libertarian country. Both Democrats and Republicans are libertarian in that sense. We hate to be told what to do by the government. The Republicans don't like to be told economically, and they don't like to be told socially. But it's the same here. So I just think, you know, part of it was mechanical, but a lot of it was just, you know, if you're not serious about campaigning and you're afraid and you're running a bunch of candidates who are trying to do their best to play dodgeball, then why would you bother to vote? Why not spend your day doing something that you can get some pleasure out of? And that's the problem.
A quick follow-up on the turnout question, which was a terrific one. Would changes such as allowing internet voting, allowing voting well in advance, make a difference in turnout among some of the disenfranchised groups?
Totally. I mean, we already saw that early voting helped a lot.
Early voting helps and mail voting helps. The turnout's generally higher in Washington and Oregon than it is. I don't actually know the turnout numbers, but even that was down. I mean, even when you get it in Oregon, everybody gets a ballot mailed to their house if they're on the checklist. There's no, you know, you have to register, but that's about it.
Well,
The turnout was down even in Oregon. I don't know.
Well, in Colorado had mail-in voting, Georgia has early voting. They had higher than the other states, but it was still low, which suggests that those features may encourage voting, but may not be necessary for the 5 to 10% percentage point increases, if that's what we're looking for. We have a question here, and then My
Let me just
American
say,
Politics
I am not
students
Obama
are
or an
going-
Obama supporter, was a very strong message for the Republican side. And so, you know, the problem was the president, and where he's being blamed, and whether you deserve it or don't deserve it, is he didn't inspire his own voters to turn out to vote. And that's where the benefit to Republicans turned out.
One key issue that wasn't addressed at all today is the Affordable Care Act. Where do you see at this point with the Republican majority in the Senate the Affordable Care Act going currently? And if a Republican candidate is voted in 2016, where do you see the
So what's the future of the Affordable Care Act?
Yes.
Great question.
The Affordable Care Act is obviously, the House has voted it down a number of times, the Senate will vote it down. A majority vote, it may not get the 60% to get it out, 60 votes. The president's going to veto the bill. So, I mean, for the foreseeable future, that's the law of the land. Now, the dilemma that we face as Americans, and whether you're for or against it, every major piece of legislation that's a 2,000-plus page bill needs amendments. And historically, any big piece of legislation that's passed in one cycle, a vast majority of people who vote for it don't even know what's in it, and they need to be modified. Every bill is modified the following year, and sometimes there's 3 or 4 times. You can't get the bill to be modified because Democrats are convinced Republicans don't want to modify it, we want to kill it. And so they're not going to take a chance of putting it up and try and make modification. So my sense is that for the next 2 years, as long as the president is there, and for the foreseeable future, if there's a Democratic president, the bill's going to be in effect with all the faults and fallacies of it. And I'm not generally condemning it. I'm just saying there's lots of pieces of it that need to be fixed, that both sides would say need to be fixed. But I would say for the foreseeable future, it's the law of the land.
I actually am more pessimistic from the point of view of somebody who thinks it's better than having nothing. The problem is there's one court case that really matters. It matters just as much as the last really big court case where Roberts turned the fee into the tax or whatever it was to save the bill. There's a case now where there's a debate over what the language of the bill said regarding subsidies for exchanges. This is all technical stuff, I understand, but for the stages that are not state exchanges, what it effectively means is if the court decides that that language was done deliberately with intent by the Senate, which I don't think it was, but that doesn't prevent the court from deciding that it was, then for those states, which is the majority of states that are relying on the federal exchange, the tax subsidy goes away. Without the tax subsidy, most of the people who really benefit from Obamacare wouldn't benefit because they couldn't afford the care. So if that case is going to get decided this year, sometime between now and the 30th of June. Sometime between now and the 30th of June. If that gets decided in the favor of the plaintiffs, which are the opponents of the bill, then I don't think it's the law of the land anymore. Then I think it's such a wreck that it's a shadow of its former self, and it's going to be effective in about 12 states.
Well, economically, it won't. It's a very delicate balance how you pay for this thing, and obviously we have this $400,000 a year consultant who basically has given his commentary the last week about how it's paid for. What the court does and what the Congress, I mean, it's still the law of the land, and obviously the court will modify it somewhat if they do, or basically implement it in a way. And I think then you may be forced to basically to make the numbers work to try and do some modification. But it's not going away. The court's not going to basically say the law is not in existence.
Right, that's right.
We had a question in the back. Natalie, I think, Lori, right, the one in the hat. Natalie, keep your hand up. There you go.
Hi, my name is Natalie, and my question is, so as Mr. Rollins said, the Republicans have the ball right now, so my question is, what issues do you think that they need to really focus on in order to set the precedent for the 2016 presidential elections?
Republicans have to move the ball forward today. They don't get the luxury of saying we need a president. If they don't basically move the ball forward and have an agenda and go to the country in 2016, because I promise you in about 3 weeks the Senate race will be as much in play as the presidential race, because of the numbers that are up next time. They have to show that they can do something. They can't do all the things they want to do, but they have to show that they can make the budget process work again, which hasn't worked for a long, long time. If they can make some progress on tax, they have to have something to go back to the public and say, this is why you need a Republican Congress or a Republican Senate. Keystone's a perfect example. I mean, that's a big issue this week that is going to get voted out. Mrs. Lando said that she has the 61st vote. The president vetoes that. Obviously, it's a big issue, and will once again add to this lack of ability to deal with the future of the Congress. But I think you're going to see an activist Congress, and they're going to try and do things. Now, that doesn't mean the president can't be an activist vetoer and push it all back. But I think they need to basically say, here's what we did, here's why we did it, here's how it would help each and every one of you, here's how we'd create jobs, infrastructure, what have you. The president wouldn't let us do that. That's the reverse of what it's been. The president has argued, I would have done all that, but the Congress wouldn't let me. Now they've got to say, we would have done all this, but the president wouldn't let us. The politics are going to start real early here. I mean, it's just, literally, I predict that Hillary and others will be in this race in the next 2 to 3 months, and you're going to have a very long presidential for the simple reason they got to raise all this money to basically be viable.
My prediction for the most interesting issue that's going to be coming up now is environmental. The president has made that certainly part of his legacy. He just recently announced a new agreement with China. Some say that it's a toothless agreement, but nonetheless there is an agreement to reduce greenhouse gases both here and eventually in China, but there's an agreement there. And the Republicans say that it's just saddling the next president with regulations. The incoming chairman in the Senate of the committee that is responsible for environmental legislation says that he doesn't believe in climate change. He's likened the Environmental Protection Agency to the Gestapo. So I think that you're gonna see a lot of action on that. And it's gonna be interesting to see that fight.
So here's the problem, building on what Ed and Josh have just said. I totally agree with both of these folks. This is the problem for the Republican Party. If they've passed a lot of legislation, but the problem is it's extremist legislation because they don't engage the Democrats because they don't have to. In the House, you don't have to engage the minority party at all. And they knew their stuff was never going to pass. So essentially they're catering to their base by passing ridiculous bills. I think if they pass a greenhouse gas bill that says greenhouse gases don't exist or climate change doesn't exist, and Obama vetoes it, that helps us. The Republicans not only have to pass legislation through the House and the Senate and go through the real process, which hasn't worked for a long time, they also have to pass legislation that the president can veto, and then you can blame the president. If the president vetoes a bill that says climate change doesn't exist, that's going to help us because our platform is going to be you can't trust the Republicans. Look at this stuff, and they're going to have a struggle inside the Republican caucus. This goes back to what I said about starting to back off some of the extreme positions, which I think we've all agreed there's some evidence they're trying to do. Now they have to legislate it. Now their people have to get up and vote against the vocal minority of their own party that has a lot to say in the primaries, and they're going to have to make a really tough choice inside the Republican caucuses on both sides about how far they want to go.
Okay. I think there's a question right there. Yeah, thank you.
Governor Dean, who do you think would be the toughest candidate your party might face in 2016? And also, do you think in 2016, when Governor Christie runs for the presidency, do you think the Tea Party contingent will support him or sabotage him?
I don't think Christie gets out of Iowa. Forget about it. It's not a good platform for the Midwest. It just isn't. I mean, I saw the clip the other day when he told some guy who was a middle-class guy who was an independent to shut up and sit down. You just can't. Yeah, you just can't do that. He's done. His problem is not Bridgegate. His problem is he doesn't. His problem is sort of the reverse of our problem with John Gruber. He's not an elitist, but he still puts down voters. I just don't think you can get away with that.
Having spent a lot of my life in other parts of the country besides New York and New Jersey, what sells in New York and New Jersey, like getting an 18-year-old putting an elbow in your throat as she's trying to get in the cab ahead of you, and get off my beach, which is the Christie, does not sell quite as well in Iowa and other parts of the country. It's a little more genteel. Right. So I've always felt that Christie was going to have problems. Equally as important, the money guys that were all, it was a great love affair for Christie initially, and I don't underestimate his ability to articulate, and he's certainly been a good fundraiser for the party. But the way the process starts, he's just going to have a hard time. And the Bridgegate basically made a lot of the money guys take a second look. If there was no alternative, and the alternative now is obviously potential of Jeb Bush getting in, or basically
or Romney
too. They're going to, these guys invest money, and they basically say, I'm not going to invest with someone that can't win. And I think the reality is that Christie, who had a good story in his first term, it's a much tougher story to tell when everything that's kind of gone bad in New Jersey, and when the legislature gets finished with all these investigative reports. I don't think he did anything improper or illegal. I think he did things that weren't very politically saleable. I think he's going to have a long, hard battle. And there's going to be, once again, there's going to be 5 or 6 other governors in there who have great stories to tell too, and each has their own. Every governor that got elected last week has a cadre of people sitting around there saying, Governor, you should run. My God, why can't we can raise the money for you? Run, baby, run. And probably even Corbett that get defeated in Pennsylvania. We can have our, Santorum came back. He lost by 18 points. You only lost by 5. So you can go to Iowa and make a new. It's the way.
So just for your amusement and Ed's amusement, I'm going to predict now that the ticket is either going to be Romney and Bush at the top and John Kasich from Ohio as the VP.
So you're saying Romney or Jeb Bush?
Romney or Jeb Bush.
Okay, well, we can tweet that.
Because the Republicans are interesting.
Prediction has been
they
made.
get all this bad press for being extremists, but they usually nominate the more moderate candidates for president, which is interesting.
Okay, so we're talking about how broad the parties are, and then we're also looking at how deep they can go. I think there was a question at the back. Juan, yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Hold on, wait for the mic.
Okay, Howard, you've mentioned that that Texas in the near future could actually go Democrat, and this is because the Hispanic population there now equals the white population in Texas. Now, the repeal of the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act kind of made Texas legislation oppose voter turnout, especially in minority and Hispanic and African American districts. How do you think this will affect 2016? And
the Hispanic population is not equal yet. In 10, 15 years, it's projected to be that, but it's not at this point in time. It's still a good Republican state. The dilemma that we've always said is if Texas goes the way of California or elsewhere, with the combination of New York, Texas, and California, and Florida being a swing state, you'll never be able to get to 270 votes if you're electoral votes if you're Republican. But Texas is not there yet, and it's obviously the population's growing, but it's still a white.
We have a huge problem in Texas. We missed our opportunity in Texas as the Democrats, and the problem is George P. Bush. George P. Bush is a Hispanic, and his name is Bush, and he's really a Hispanic. His mother's Mexican American. He speaks perfect Spanish. His skin complexion is a little darker. It looks a little like. So he could have been born in Mexico. I think this guy is now a statewide office holder. He's the land commissioner. When Greg Abbott leaves the governorship in Texas, I think the next candidate is George P. Bush, and I think he wins with a big percentage of the Hispanic vote. So I think we've missed our opportunity in Texas. I think we're going to have to do something really different. We have some great Hispanic candidates like the Castro brothers, and we couldn't get them to run this time. And I think we got a big problem now. The only Hispanic candidate who I think could win on the Democratic side is Leticia Vanderpoot, and she's had trouble raising the money, and and Texas is not Hispanic enough yet, so that I think we can reliably win.
I think
it's a real problem. It's a real problem.
Yeah, I think that Democrats are mistaken if they think that the Latino vote is shored up for them. I mean, look at the governor of New Mexico. There's all sorts of
Nevada,
right. So there's a lot of Latino Republicans out there.
We're almost out of time, so I want to pick up with Howard. You made a prediction on the Republican side. On the Democrat side, are you kind of going with the consensus as far as who the nominee will be? And if so, who will the VP be? And I was going to go to you next, Ed. Hold on. Howard, what about finishing up the Democratic side?
I think if Hillary runs, she's going to be the nominee, but I don't think she's made that decision, and I don't know what the chance is that she doesn't run. I don't think it's 50-50, but I think there is a chance she'll make a different decision than most people think. So we'll see. If she runs, she gets the nomination.
It'll be messier than a lot of Democrats. A lot of people expect. People don't like a coronation.
Right.
That's if you're voters. Reporters like to have more of a contest. She's a Clinton. She's run before. They've been in power for a long time. I really have to see what her narrative is, what her story is. I mean, people know her, but does she offer anything new?
Yeah, she offers something new. She's a woman.
But she's run before.
I don't think you can underestimate the intensity of I have a 19-year-old daughter who goes to Mount Holyoke. I say, what do you want to be? She goes, I want to work for Hillary.
Sorry. Oh, have her come call me. I can help her out.
But at the end of the day, I think there is, we're coming down to 2 or 3 percentage points, and there's an intensity. I mean, what President Obama was able to do was intensify the African American and the non-white vote in his 2 elections, and that was very important. So if you can get 2 or 3 or 4% more than you normally would with a majority of the voters in America, that's a very significant factor. My game, if she doesn't run, I hope it's John Kerry and Joe Biden in whatever order it is, and Howard Dean running to their left. So that's
that might get me back in the race.
Well, I think this is the appropriate point to say to be continued. Please join me in thanking the panelists for a very informative discussion.
And thank you all for showing up, and we hope that you show the same enthusiasm next time there's an election.
We'll do this again in November 2016, and we'll have many events before then, too.